And we're now going to change gear a little bit and talk about actually implementing some of these changes. You just asked that question of, you know, we always hear when it's gone wrong. That makes a great headline, but how often do we see the headlines of when it goes right, when organizations actually kick into gear and make this happen? And I'm delighted to be joined by two people that are going to talk us through that, but we probably also can give you a little break if you like, Catherine. Yes. And while you refresh and catch up, I'm going to be joined by Craig Drummond from MEDIBANK and SHELLEY Roberts from Compass. And these are two people who I know believe strongly in addressing sexual harassment and respect in the workplace. Craig joined MEDIBANK in 2016 as the Chief Executive Officer, and you left them just recently, Craig. I'm sure they were devastated to lose you. But in that time, you've been a huge champion. You've got over 30 years experience in financial sector, but you also are one of the champions of change in the coalition. You've also been a leader speaking out on gender issues and respect in the workplace. And you've also committed to addressing domestic violence. So a huge portfolio. And Craig, thank you so much for that work. And then also joined by SHELLEY Roberts. And SHELLEY is the Managing Director of the Compass Group in Australia. She has the unenviable task of having 11,000 employees spread across 500 workplaces. And whenever I chat to SHELLEY, I am just humbled by the complexity of your workforce, SHELLEY, and the steps you've taken to try and protect people in often very difficult workplaces. And so it really is a joy to have both of you joining me to talk about what it takes to make a safe workplace. And we've asked you each just to share your story. And I'm going to ask you, SHELLEY, to take us away first and share the story of, and I love the sign behind you that just says, let's change the way we're thinking. So over to you, SHELLEY. Let's hear how you've been taking this on.
Thanks, Jenny, and hi, Craig. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this today. My first Not in My Workplace summit was 2 years ago in Melbourne, in the amphitheatre, and I still remember how much I thought I knew, but how much I learned that I didn't know about the topic. And as Kate Jenkins spoke that day and shared all the statistics, it just really galvanized me to say, not in my workplace. Yeah. And at the risk of looking like a washed up ghost today, I just wanted to share this background because I think, you know, picking up on what Prue was saying, we all have a role to play in education. And when we think about it as corporate leaders, we educate every day. We educate people how to read a P&L. We educate them how to negotiate a contract. We educate them how to create a safe workplace. And so how can we really step that up? And what does creating a safe workplace mean? Outside of the legislation, you know, we know that culture and leadership and inclusion are actually the cornerstones of creating a safe workplace. And so that's what we've been working on. And I thought maybe to try and make some of that accessible today, I would share it in the context of a management framework. And the management framework that I think most applies is skill, will, and drill. And then I'm going to throw one other in there, which is about focused investment. So I think starting with will, I think, you know, the reason we're all together today is to take a stand and say from the top of each organization, this will not happen in my workplace. I will not tolerate this in my workplace. And so tone from the top, I think, is absolutely critical. It needs to be something that the leadership of the organization speaks about every day, every week, and constantly in order to permeate the organization, particularly, you know, of the scale that we are in Australia. We have to keep talking about it in order to keep it front of mind and keep talking about the fact that we have a zero tolerance approach towards it. So that's my first point on will. I think going to the second point on skill absolutely is something we need to train. In the same way we train technical skills in our organization, we need to train behavioral skills in our organization. And I loved what Prue was saying about it comes down to the line leader on a site in the middle of, in her case, Roxby Downs, Pulborough, wherever this leader might be, to A, have the knowledge as to what's acceptable and not acceptable, and then B, to take that stand. And as we were saying, that's really something that can be quite difficult. And so how do we upskill our leaders and leaders at all levels to be able to have that knowledge and have that skill to intervene in the moment to actually prevent the psychological injury. And then the third point is drill. And this is where I come to the workplace systems, the workplace processes. How do we put prevention and detection systems in place in exactly the same way we do for physical safety? And that was one of the key takeaways I had from the first Not in My Workplace conference, was when Kate said psychological injury lasts a lot longer than a broken bone or a cut finger. And so why wouldn't we put equal, if not more, emphasis on psychological injury and adapt our safety systems that we already have in our business and extend them to psychological injury and psychological safety? And so for me, that's the drill part. Last point, I think, in terms of focused investment, I think in order to create an inclusive workplace, it takes intervention. And we have to be very deliberate about diversity. We have to be very deliberate about selection. We have to be very deliberate about growing our talent so that we're creating equal opportunity for everybody to be able to participate, whether that's someone who identifies as working with a disability, whether it's someone from an Indigenous background, or whether it's women. And as we were saying earlier, intersectional inclusion is so important, because we know that often the victims of sexual harassment will also find themselves as identifying as being part of a minority group. And so really thinking about all of our training programs being targeted, focused and deliberate about directing that funding towards some of these vulnerabilities in the organisation and building capability in those areas, I think can make all the difference. So those are my 4 points. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Shelley. And I'm sure, Craig, listening to that, I saw you nodding along. Some of these will probably resonate with you, but please share your story as well.
Thanks, Jenny, and Shelley, well done. You've left me with absolutely nothing to say. No, that is not true, but thanks, Jenny. It's a real privilege to speak today, and I think my background is sort of interesting because it includes secondary education at an all-boys school, a long career in the male-dominated investment banking industry, and a long career in commercial banking prior to the 5-year stint at MEDIBANK. So, you know, my employers, I'd say my employers have always been respectful, but they've probably been not particularly diverse. So I've had quite a few learnings coming from that sort of male-dominated background into an environment that MEDIBANK, MEDIBANK has been a truly diverse organisation. So, you know, what have we done at the organisation to drive that diversity? Well, I think at the overarching point I'd make is, and it's perhaps not initially obvious, and that is creating and maintaining a strong organisational purpose that's centred on, you know, favourable outcomes for customers rather than favourable outcomes for individual employees. And that certainly has grounded the culture of the organisation to do the right thing. And it's really grounded the organisation to focus externally rather than internally. And, you know, sure, it's great for organisational performance to focus on your customers. Everyone knows that. But it does reinforce the focus of why we're all here in the workplace. And that's ultimately, we think, is to centre it around our customers' outcomes and doing the right thing externally. And you know what, it does actually help and builds a culture to do the right thing internally. You know, secondly, getting the gender and diversity balance in the workplace is clearly critical. And I think, you know, we all know that. But at MEDIBANK, we've ensured it starts right at the top. So the board's four women, 4 men, top 50 execs, 51% female. We've got the usual progressive and supportive policies to promote diverse and inclusive culture. But, and they're sort of relatively obvious again around gender pay gaps that we monitor. We have parental leave for everyone, not just women. So 25% of our parental leave is now taken by men inside the organisation, and 25% of our total population are male. So it's proportional to our population. But of course, we expect our leaders to absolutely role model all of the values and behaviours that we've agreed as an organisation are the right values and behaviours, and that there is real consequence for poor behaviour. And I think that's another issue which is, again, pretty obvious. But for strong performers, there's the same consequences there is for poor performers. I think thirdly, just the recruitment, development and promotion of leaders and aligning those, and for those that do align around the organisation's values and expectations is really critical. We've been, like I'm sure Shelley has as well, we've been prepared to make some tough decisions on individuals who don't meet the standards and the values that we accept inside our organisation, not only just to financial penalties or, it does go to employment loss. And we have made people redundant, or we've fired people internally where there's been poor behaviour, not just sexual harassment, but broadly speaking, poor behaviour that can obviously ultimately manifest into very serious poor behaviour like sexual harassment. So there has to be real consequence for poor behaviour, and I would say within Medibank that is definitely the case. Additionally, we've ensured that I think it's critical that you have a really great, strong leader in the P&C or the people and culture function, and a well-resourced people and culture function. Now, of course, it's ultimately the leaders that need to role model behaviour, but in the training, the execution and the embedding of culture, I do believe P&C play a really crucial role in that execution piece. So yes, the role modelling has to come from board and senior execs, but if you've got a weak P&C function, I think it makes the execution of what you expect through the organisation all that much more difficult. And I think the other thing we've done inside Medibank, which is interesting, is at a board level, the board meets regularly with a large cross-section of our top 50 executives in the company. And they meet every board cycle. We have these meetings without any of the senior executives, the most senior executives in the company being involved. So the board get to discuss a whole range of topics, not just about company strategy and performance, but it's actually about what's really going on in the workplace. And the fact that none of the very senior execs are in those meetings does actually bring a fair bit of focus and focuses the minds of those senior execs as to what the board's actually discussing with the leaders at the next level down, and in fact the next level down, without any sort of guidance and chaperoning. So, I think that's certainly something we've developed. And I think the other thing, as a chief executive, I do spend considerable period of time each month doing what we call brown bag sessions with a very diverse group of employees without any other leaders in the organisation sitting in those meetings. And you might say, well, are these young people going to talk up? Well, in groups they do. In groups they do. And whether that's groups of senior females, groups of less senior females, groups of more diverse Australians, or in minority groups, I think that's something that the chief executive should spend time at. So from my perspective, culture is not something that's sustained by policies and procedures and employee surveys. Yeah, they're helpful and they're essential, as is ongoing training. And I heard Prue talk about that. That's all important. But ultimately, culture is driven by the behaviours and the standards that the board and the senior execs in the organisation set. And if you hire the wrong and retain the wrong people, or you fail to take the appropriate action when issues do arise, then no amount of policy or procedure is going to drive a respectful workplace culture. The buck stops with us. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Craig, and some really scary tactics that you're sharing with us there of having everyone talk to everyone, but what a great idea. And we hear all the time that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and yet we spend an enormous amount of time on strategy and talking strategy across organizations, but seldom put the same effort into culture. And as Prue said, we're not talking about the ballet here. We're talking about the way we behave, what we talk about, what we hold to be important. As you've been on these cultural journeys trying to change the culture within your organizations, What has worked? What did you think gave you that real pivotal moment where you could feel you were getting the traction? And Shelley, what do you think brings that about?
I think it's looking at bottom-up change as well as top-down change together at the same time. And I'll give you an example of a bottom-up change in our organisation where a group of people got together. We'd had 2 near suicides as part of our team, and a team got together and said, we just don't want to, we can't let this happen. Thank goodness those 2 didn't. We've just got to stop this. What are we going to do? And they formulated a campaign called the #GotYourBack. And it was this brilliant bottom-up groundswell of people getting together. They recorded a video of people who had these experiences, who'd been disrespected, and they shared their stories. And off the back of that came the organisation sharing in that and going, well, we've got to do something more. We want to make sure that in every workplace, there's always a Got Your Back champion. And so now we have Got Your Back champions who wear a special coloured shirt, so everybody knows who they are. We give them support in terms of counselling support. So if people do come to them, they know how to handle those situations. And that movement has just gone from strength to strength. And so I think as an enabler of culture change, the power of storytelling and having peer-to-peer storytelling is so critical. I think the second change that I would reference is the top-down change, where we got really deliberate about building diverse teams. Because what we've noticed is that in diverse teams, people come forward. And if you have a team that's gender diverse, or you have a team that's diverse from a nationality standpoint, you're going to find that those employees from those groups are going to feel more comfortable then talking to those leaders. And a small example of a moment that came during COVID, when we had actually set up this line that you can see behind me here, which is for people to call in, is we actually had a number of our Indigenous team members come forward and say, actually, we'd like to have Indigenous leaders on this line so that when we call in, we're actually speaking to an Indigenous person who understands our culture. And I thought that was just a little example of, how we can facilitate that with our management processes, but the organisation being empowered to speak up and actually request that.
I just love that, Shelley, that we know culture's working when the bottom-up starts to take it on. And sometimes we just have to resist the temptation of taking it over, but kind of create a safe place for bottom-up initiatives that are aligned with the culture you're trying to create. Craig,
incubate those bottom-up opportunities and allow them to grow.
Craig, what are your lessons there?
Jenny, I think, let me go top down. I think it's actually, as a public company, one of the things I've noticed, if you go back 3 to 4 years, 5, 6 years ago, there was very little conversation in the boardroom, very little reporting in the boardroom around diversity and inclusion, very little consequence to senior executives for not meeting what were then very soft targets. Today, and we do in MEDIBANK, we have a series of targets that are dashboarded up into the board, into risk committee and into board, and the executives are asked to talk about that every 6 months, about how we're tracking to targets. They are published in our annual report, not just occupational health and safety, but a whole series of diversity targets. And if we don't meet them, there is real consequence. And we have conversations in our remuneration committee about not meeting those targets. I must admit, I've got to a point where I've got a bit frustrated about a number of these things across the broader, let's call it the ASX 200 companies. And I'm an advocate for mandating targets. And, I do understand that we need to put the right people in the right roles and with the right skills and set them up for success and not set them up for failure. But we're still moving too slowly. And what I see in MEDIBANK is when we publish those rigorous dashboards into, and I know Prue was talking about this with Catherine before, but when we've put those rigorous dashboards and had meaningful conversations where there is consequence for employees around their and senior execs around not only their remuneration, but the way they are rated and promoted internally, that's the rubber hitting the road. And I don't think at this stage in the ASX 200, we've gone hard enough on that aspect. That's because I've seen, I sat in, I won't publicise it now, but I was the CFO of one of the 4 major banks, and I saw what was there and what we're doing in Medibank, and there is a difference.
It really is this accountability piece that makes culture have skin in the game. Shelley, one of the questions that's come in from the audience, and again, I'd appeal to everyone out there that if you're listening and you have some questions, this is a talent pool you really want to ask. Shelley, they're asking, how do you help people approach a difficult situation respectfully? Because often by the time they've worked up their courage to ask, they're angry and emotional, and that's just the worst possible way to get into it. How do you help people have these difficult discussions?
I think, part of it is to destigmatize having them. So really be talking about it, as I was saying, frequently enough that it just becomes as if they're reporting someone having a safety incident. Or, I think the role of the ally is so critical, and doing formal training for people. I mean, that's where our training's now evolved to, having created the awareness with the peer-to-peer storytelling. We're now moving to and here's how you can help. So often in that heated exchange, if there's actually an ally who can come in and support, or after the fact, the ally can be the person to report, that really helps us to get greater visibility on the occurrences. And it also helps us, I think, to identify trends so that we can understand perhaps if there's one individual, because there might have been, a more minor issue 2 weeks ago that then gets repeated and builds and eventually becomes something much, much more serious. So I don't know that there's a silver bullet to that, other than to say that it's like any other situation in the organisation. If you talk about it and you make it okay, and you've got psychological safety for people coming forward, and you're encouraging everyone to do it, it eventually reaches a tipping point where it becomes the norm. That's the way of working.
It's interesting, we don't get angry when someone reports a slip or trip, but we do get angry if we say that joke was inappropriate or that comment was inappropriate. And we really need to move to that kind of place. Craig, we talk a bit about bravery and innovation, and Shelley's shared that wonderful story. What's the bravest or most innovative thing you've seen happening in your workplace?
I would say, Jenny, probably, and it's not only in our workplace, but it's in workplaces around the country. And Brittany Higgins is probably the best public example of this, is the bravery and how courageous women have become in speaking up and sharing their stories. That is incredibly brave. And I don't think anything else I could put on the table would match that. Clearly, that's really concerning, and it shouldn't be the case that these women are being put in this situation. But I think it's important we acknowledge that, and as a male and as men, we acknowledge the courageous approach of these women. CEOs and chairs of companies, we're in really privileged positions and we can lead change. And I actually don't think that there's anything particularly brave about what we as leaders can do compared to what women are doing coming forward with their stories. So I think it's more for people like us to be innovative rather than brave, but innovative in the way we think about these issues going forward. And a lot of it, in my mind, is normalising things, disrupting the gendered norms that we have around, the expectations of women as carers. And that's why things like parental leave for men is so important. For the last couple of years, we've offered 14 weeks paid leave for men. And I think that just, as I said, it breaks down those gendered norms and disrupts those power disparities that lead to all the issues that we've been talking about before today. For me, it's acknowledging women's stories and taking action as a result.
And Shelley, I know in talking to you, you have staff in very diverse environments, in mining camps, in hospitality, and you're really trying to think about how you change the environment, because if we don't change the environment, we're going to keep seeing the same things happening over and over. Do you want to share a little bit about the bravery and innovation in that kind of space you guys are thinking about?
Sure. I mean, I think the first point I would say is it's very much about working in partnership with our clients, because our team members live in the community together with their team members, and it's one community. So to have the impact, you've got to work in partnership with all the stakeholders who have employment relationships in those communities. I think the second point is, thinking about the design of the environment. So, when we think of what does a safe workplace look like in a mining camp? Well, it doesn't look like putting the gym right next to the wet mess so that women need to be concerned about walking to the gym in their exercise gear past the wet mess. It goes to making sure there's sufficient lighting in the mining camp so that you're not creating the opportunity for predators. It goes to their dining experience to make sure that actually we're providing choice and supporting inclusion in the services that are provided. It's about providing activities that are diverse so that everybody can participate in those activities. So it's so multidimensional, but I think it comes down to thinking of it as a community, thinking it as a subset of society, and then in the same way, we all live in a safe home and we've got, burglar bars on the window and all that sort of thing. How do you actually create those detection systems so that people can feel safe in their living environment, because it is a 24/7 living environment for people in these remote communities.
Jenny, if I can just say, one of the other things that I should have mentioned that we're all clearly working through is there's been a lack of transparency in allowing women also to tell their story. We've all been hung up with NDAs, and through the Champions of Change, we have seen one or two organisations beginning to give women the choice of telling their story and not being shut down. And I think this is something that it's still very early days, but we're all going to have to get braver, both corporates and to some extent maybe even for some of the victims, if it's their choice to be brave, to tell their story at a time that suits them. It's not necessarily at the time of immediately post the issue, but I think this whole issue of NDAs needs to be sorted out. We as a corporate, particularly in the corporate sector, it's been very convenient for us to stay quiet.
Yeah, Craig, what a great point. It really is about that bravery of not trying to hide behind the law, not trying to hide behind what's easy. And Shelley, I love your examples, because it's not just about what we say and do, it's about looking at the artifacts of everything we do in our business and where have people been harmed, the same as we would in any other situation. If we cast ourselves forward 12 months, we know right now this is a really hot topic. There's so much happening around us. Almost every week we see changes. What are the changes that you're both looking forward to in the next 12 months? What would you like to see happening? And let's start this time with you, Craig.
Well, I think, Jenny, probably the thing that really comes to mind is men's involvement. And it's sort of interesting, in part because MEDIBANK does provide the 1-800 Respect service for the federal government. Over the last 5 years, I've had a lot more involvement in in this area. But frankly, we need more men stepping up to call out poor behaviour. More men need to be invited to solve the problem for leaders. We need to have leaders and learners doing this work, not just the leaders. We need younger men also involved learning. It's at the moment, as I said, there's too few men, and the men that are involved tend to be CEOs. We need men further through the organisation. So I was shocked, actually, when I first looked at domestic violence and sexual assault probably 5 or 6 years ago, that males account for more than 90% of this behaviour. And yet, and a conference like today, again, there are very few males involved. I think we all need to just, we need to get, a much higher level of male involvement in this topic. That would be my major ask over the next 12 months.
Well, maybe
they're the perpetrators.
Maybe, Craig, we should make that happen, that between the champions of change and Not in My Workplace, we get much more diverse group together and keep having these discussions. Shelley, what would you look forward to in the next 12 months?
Well, Craig, I'm pleased to let you know I have 12 team members on the call, and at least 7 of them are men. So,
well, thanks, Shelley. That's
Compass Group men, you're listening to Craig, so we can take our lead from him. But I think we've all shared the aspiration. About 6 months ago, we moved our safety systems to include psychological injury, and so our same safety protocols apply. Our fatal risk protocols in terms of immediate escalation, immediately being dealt with, etc. So I think that's the detection process, but I think the prevention process we can still all do so much more on. So yes, Jenny, addressing the ecosystem, addressing the workplace, looking at all those totems, it's like workplace safety. You never get there. So we can continue to make the workplace safer and safer and safer and safer until we end at zero sexual harassment and an absolutely inclusive, respectful behaviour. And so that would be my goal. I'd love to get there in 12 months, a culture of absolute respect in the workplace with zero incidents. And hey, that's what we're all striving for.
And so my final question, and there's been some wonderful comments coming through, just really appreciating the work you're both doing and the insights that you've given as leaders. I reflect on having a chat with some of my team, with my staff, and one of the young men asked, if I'm unsure of whether I should say or do something, where do I get advice? And should I go to HR? And my HR practitioner, who I love to bits, just said, no, if you're asking that question, just don't do it. Don't come and ask me. Just if you have any doubt, don't do it at all. But as you're talking to young emerging leaders or other leaders who are listening in today who are thinking, how do they get started? What is your best advice to people as they get started on this journey? You've both had an extensive journey through this. How do they get started? Let's start with you, Shelley.
I would say educate, educate, educate. The reason I've got this poster up behind me is it's one of 7 posters we actually did with a creative agency. The other ones say things like, I was just joking, and it's scratched out and it says, I was just, sexually harassing. So I think everybody, I see this as ripples in a pond, right? Everybody can have an impact on 10 more people, and those 10 people can have an impact on another 100 people, and eventually we'll get to the population. I think we have to take that step. And I think if anyone is sitting here thinking it's not happening in their workplace, it absolutely is. So take that stand, say not in my workplace, and everybody can take that. It's great that CEOs can take that stand, but every single person can take that stand. And if you can be an ally rather than a bystander, if you can educate, that will take us in a forward direction. So that's my call to action.
Craig?
Completely agree, Shelley. I think it's a call out to men from my perspective to step up, listen and learn, educate yourself, and frankly, don't be a bystander. It's a gutless position to be in. I think go and speak to your some of the senior females in your organisation as well. Understand their perspective. Don't go to your P&C partner. go and speak to people in the business, understand what they're going through, and understand what culture you want to be a part of. I think as organisations and as individuals, we do need to prioritise prevention. And again, Prue talked about that. It's much easier than the response. The response is difficult. It's very, very challenging for all parties, and we don't want to be in that position. We want to, as I said, prioritise prevention. So from my perspective, it all comes, and I know Prue didn't necessarily agree with this, but I do think a lot of it comes back to gender equality and having gender balanced workplaces. If we have gender imbalance and particularly leaders, gender imbalance in leadership, it's a disaster.
Thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today and for your commitment to this topic. I know you are representing actually a lot of leaders and CEOs that are deeply concerned about this issue. None of us would willingly see our colleagues, our staff hurt in this kind of way. And it is a harm, and it's a harm that we can seldom understand what the ramifications are going to be from the moment it occurs until it plays out. And I would ask anyone again who, if this conversation or any of our conversations so far have brought up any items that you're worried about, the 1-800-RESPECT line that Craig is backing is available. People are available to take those calls, and please make those reports. We are going to take a break because I know we've all been using a lot of our headspace. And as we take the break, please join me thanking Craig and Shelley. It's just been wonderful having you both share that experience. And Craig, there's people voting for you into high office because they love what you're talking about. But I really want to thank both of you, and on behalf of your staff, just the incredible difference you must have been able to make in their workplaces.